Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum, which is a podcast about surveying mentally ill religious people.
John.
Sorry, this is a podcast of around 12 years of ethnographic research onto ASD1 Christians and ex-Christians, covering over 600 interviews and around 26,000 identified online personas. So we've already done an episode about the experiences of autistic mothers and in pregnancy and early infancy. But what we have not covered, and what people have requested that I cover, is what happens to autistic parents in general once those infants stop being infants and start being children. So this episode, we are going to be talking about that specifically. This is not a prescriptive episode. We are not giving you advice on what to do. This is what works and this is what doesn't. This is a observation from observing autistic parents and the experiences that they have. So if you want specific advice, don't take it from me because I don't have any. Yeah, and with me I have Alyssa. Alyssa has been on the podcast many times, and she is also an autistic mom of 2 autistic kids. So I guess you can introduce yourself.
So my name is Alyssa. I've been on a few previous episodes, mostly about either high control religion or about books and articles that John and I have both read and talked about. We tend to introduce me as an amateur mime and unaccredited Latin teacher. And that is a joke because that's, never relevant to what we're talking about. But in this case, for me, I don't know how I would be an autistic mom if I did not have the background of being a second language teacher and a performer. I just don't know how I would do it.
Yeah. This is probably going to come up a few times in the episode. So for this episode, someone was like, you know what you should do for the infancy and pregnancy episode and the experience of autistic mothers in those situations. You interviewed your mom. You should interview your dad for this episode. And great suggestion. No, that's not going to happen. I love my dad. He's great. He is a 70-year-old man with Asperger's syndrome and no social filter. He will not be on the podcast. There would be many things he would have to say that particularly productive, I fear. And the conversation would immediately start veering to something that he's actually interested in about rather than the podcast topic. So I love my dad, but I'm not that good at editing. So we're just going to stick with me and Alyssa for this episode. Yeah, so the stats that I'm working with. I group parents into different buckets. So if they have one child over one of these ages, I put them in the buckets. So you have buckets 3 to 8, or 0 to 3, 3 to 8, 8 to 14, 14 to 18, and 18 plus. I am mostly going to be focusing on the 3 to 8 and 8 to 14 buckets in this episode because that's what I have most data on. So,
and I have a foot in each of those buckets. I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old.
And yeah, and you've had your foot in that bucket for at least I guess 7 years, if you count your 10-year-old. So yeah, the data that I have collected skews heavily under the age of 35, which means that most of the parents in my data set do not have kids older than 14. It's just the nature of the beast when doing ethnographic autism research. Most people who are older don't have an autism diagnosis, even if they actually do have autism. So they're unlikely to be found to be a person that you can interview. I've gone over age biases and data collection and how those things affect stuff. So I have in my interviews 117 moms. 88 of those have a child over 3 at the time of interview. 52 of them have a child over 8. I have interviewed 180 dads, 133 have a child over 3 at time of interview, and 87 have a child over 8. This is wildly disproportionate in when you look at the average ASD1 population. Autistic Christians are more likely to have kids than non-Christian autistics.
Is that because of religious belief and subculture?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is a effective religious belief in subculture, as far as I can tell. It's generally speaking, religious people are more likely to have kids. Autistic religious people are not really an exception. They do have lower rates than their non-autistic counterparts, but still higher than their non-Christian counterparts. In general, like on the internet, I have found 1,600 around 1,600 autistic women that I know have children, and 1,100 ish of them have a child over 3, and around 300 have a child over 8. I have found approximately 3,500 autistic men that I know have children. Around 2,500 of those have a child over 3. Around 800 have a child over 8. Again, the reason for this is age skew. So most of the people in the data sets that I find are just younger, and so as a result have younger children. Generally speaking, also autistic people have kids later than their non-autistic counterparts, and so the kids that they have will generally be younger in the data collection. 18% that have at least one child do not have an autistic child. So that means 82% of them have an autistic child. If they have at least one child, there is an 18% chance that none of them will be autistic. However, that is to say most of them have an autistic child. The average number of children that autistic Christians tend to have is 2.2. I have not factored this in with childless autistics. So of those that have children, the average number is 2.2. And the mode, like the most common number of children, is 2 that autistic people will have. The mode does change based on denomination, though. Protestants typically will have 2. Catholics, the number is usually 3. It's just Catholics, generally speaking, have one more child than Protestants as their number. So that is that. There are some exceptions to that. The general trends in the dataset, or actually, I'll stop. Any questions about those numbers in particular?
What I am hearing is that maybe I'm saying this wrong, is that while we are talking about the experience of being an autistic parent, that is not often separable from parenting autistic children. These things are happening at the same time.
Correct. There is also an interesting biasing effect in this. And the biasing effect is that most autistic parents that I talk to who have an autistic child did not get diagnosed until they had a child, especially in women. This is the most common. And so the reason that like only 18% of them don't have an autistic child, there is a biasing factor in that. Whereas the reason that they know they're autistic is because their child got diagnosed. And so if you are autistic and you don't have any autistic kids, you are less likely to know that you are autistic yourself.
That makes sense. And it also makes me frustrated with the section of the library on autism because most of the books in the parenting and autism category, at least that are readily available at your local library, assume a non-autistic parent who needs to understand autism in order to parent their autistic child. And I remember reading a lot of those books and thinking, all the things you're explaining to me are things that I don't need explained to me because they are common sense to me, because my kid's brain is a lot like mine. It doesn't tell me how to help myself and my kid at the same time.
Yep, many
So you
such
would
cases.
so you would
It
think
is.
more of the resources would account for that. It is highly likely that one or both parents are also neurodivergent, but they
You
don't
would
necessarily.
you would think so. They certainly don't, and I think that is a major gap in the literature. Um, and the ones that do, you tend to get a heavy skew towards either the profoundly affected autistics or the not profoundly at all affected autistics, because the profoundly affected, or the people with profoundly affected children, are motivated to write the book because they really need help. The ones who have children who are not as profoundly affected actually have the time and resources to do it, but the ones in the middle are in this very weird gray zone of not having the time or the resources to do it, but also the need to write it doesn't feel as dire. And so there is a sort of there is a gap in the literature as well that I've noticed of not profoundly affected but not mildly affected, somewhere in the middle. The space between ASD1 and ASD2 is not well documented in parenting literature, and I think that's just for like a bunch of reasons that come from what happens when you're writing books, or why you want to write books, and the motivations and incentives, and then the free time that you have available to do it. And also, it's quite tough talking about that area, because your child is still like capable, but also has a lot of struggles that aren't directly related to things, and so it's often hard to articulate exactly what the problem is or how to solve it. And often, like, these things are so varied, and that's going to be a theme throughout this episode. Everything is so varied that it's very hard to like give actual useful advice. And so that might also be another case, because if you are in one of these circles, you are probably going to conferences or meeting other autistic moms, and then you will quickly realize, oh, these kids have very different issues than my kids. And it's all a grab bag of heterogeneity. So overall, more trends. Autistic Christians have fewer kids than their denominational peers in general. So they will tend to have fewer kids. They will tend to have fewer kids, especially if there is an autistic woman, non-autistic man pairing. They will have fewer kids than their denominational peers if there is an autistic man, autistic woman pairing. They will have around the same number of kids as their denominational peers if there is an autistic man, non-autistic woman pairing. So that pairing doesn't seem to have fewer kids. They tend to have more kids than all the other pairs. The pairing with the most kids in general are autistic men with non-autistic women partners. The reasons that they don't want more kids is typically cited in lists in the order. Can you guess what number one is?
Not wanting to be outnumbered, I would
So
assume, would be
not
one of
wanting to
them.
be outnumbered is close to it. It's being sensorily overwhelmed.
Yeah, the
And yeah,
sensory overwhelm and just I mean, kind of some things you talked about with Maddie on a previous episode, some of the body horror of pregnancy and childbirth and early parenthood for a mom is intense. So I would assume that's part of it. That not being avoiding sensory overwhelm and just not wanting to be outnumbered. Because if you are outnumbered, then if both kids are having a meltdown, if more than one kid is having a meltdown, and there are not as many adults in the house as there are kids, that is a lot harder to manage.
yeah, exactly. And so it's sensorily overwhelmed, and then it's already hard to take care of yourself and probably your autistic child. Just statistically speaking, you will likely have an autistic child to take care of, and you think, oh God, what if we get another one like this? I can't do that. I love my child, but oh no, what am I going to do here if I have to have another one? And, one starts having a meltdown, and that sets off the other one, which starts having a meltdown. Do I need 3 simultaneous meltdowns happening, or can we just stick to 2? That's sort of the reasoning in it. It makes sense to me, but yeah, that's generally speaking why the most common number is 2. There is one giant anomaly in this data set. Do you know what it is?
I
Can
do
you guess?
not. Let's see, are there a
Autistic Christian
handful of,
men over the age of 40.
okay, that they have more children?
Yes.
I don't,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
okay,
They will typically have far more children than the average autistic couple. Most autistic men over 40 have 3 kids in
okay.
my data set. Yes, that is for a lot of reasons. One of them seems to be cultural. It was just more common to have more kids back then, I guess. So that's one. But the other one is they tend not to be married to autistic women. They tend to be married to neurotypical women over the age of 40. The most common pairing for autistic men over the age of 40 is they're married to a non-autistic woman. And yeah, so if you're an autistic Christian man over the age of 40, you probably have more kids than every other autistic, in my data set, at least. I don't know how representative of like a general trend that is, but interesting anomaly. Yeah, most people in my data set are not diagnosed when they had their first child. So most people are not. However, there is one category that is more likely to be diagnosed than the other, and that is autistic men. So autistic men are far more likely to be diagnosed before their first child than autistic women. Autistic women are most commonly diagnosed when they become a mom, either in the early stages, like we talked about in the pregnancy episode, like you get early stages postpartum depression, go to a therapist, haha, you're autistic. And the other one is you make it through the gauntlet of early motherhood, and then your child isn't speaking. And so you take them to the occupational therapist, and the doctor goes, ooh, it's autism. And you go, damn, I shouldn't have vaccinated my kid. And they're like, no, the call is coming from inside the house. No vaccine can stop them with your genetics. So yeah, that happens. So most common time to get diagnosed is when your child gets diagnosed. It's also common for autistic men. It's just more likely that an autistic man will be diagnosed before the first child than it is the woman. So around 30% of autistic men get diagnosed with their child in my data set. It is around 70% of autistic women who get diagnosed with their child. So that's the general split. Most common vocation out of all of the parents is stay-at-home mom. So it is stay-at-home mom, or it is part-time casual work, either as a teacher or nurse or something like that. And that is for a very particular reason, which is they probably have an autistic kid, and managing that autistic kid is a job in and of itself. And so often it is not that they don't want to have a career, it's that they do not have the time, the energy, or the ability to manage their children who have disabilities and a full-time career. It just isn't viable and isn't feasible. And so typically the mom will be a stay-at-home mom. It's especially common in Christian circles. Like that's what by default happens in society, and that is what happens in Christian circles even more so, and it's far more normalized than the other way around. So that's generally what you get. Most people who have ASD kids have ASD1 kids. So most people who have kids, their kids are ASD1. The next largest majority is ASD2 or an ASD1-2 split. So for those who don't know, ASD has two categories: social deficits in social and emotional reciprocity across multiple contexts, and restrictive and repetitive behaviors. And you can get ASD2 in one of those and ASD1 in the other. So you get a split diagnosis. So the next largest group after ASD1 is an ASD1-2 split and ASD2. Small minority have ASD3. So most ASD1 parents that I have in my data set do not have ASD3 children. It's around 5% that do. So of those that have them, around 5% have ASD3 kids. They typically have kids later than their peers is another one. So typically in the, they usually start in their later 20s or early 30s. The general trend of like common differences between them and their peers, their peer mothers, is that their kids just have significantly more issues. And so they are doing the work, right? A lot of moms sort of biggest complaints will be their like ideal scenario for like, oh man, I wish this is what I had to deal with. That sounds nice. And so that's the general trend in like the big differences. And basically Christianity doesn't have a very significant effect. It has some significant effects in some areas of life, but generally speaking, autistic parents of autistic children are very similar to in terms of their parenting experiences to their non-Christian peers who are also autistic and have autistic kids. You know, I'm going to try not to say throughout this episode that, like, well, you know, what's it like having an autistic child as an autistic parent? It's like you have autism and they have autism. We'll try not to repeatedly say that, but the final trends is success and ease and like ability to thrive is largely based on your spouse. So if you look at the most influential factors in whether or not you will survive your ordeal, is how supportive is your spouse and how on board with everything is your spouse. There are many horror stories I could regale you with, which I will try not to stop the black pilling, but there are many cases of autistic women who are married to autistic men who refuse to acknowledge they're autistic, and that refusal to acknowledge that they're autistic causes many autism-related problems, and especially causes autism-related problems with their children, because they don't believe their children are autistic either, and
so when their kid is struggling,
yes.
So when their kid is struggling, they would want the kid to do what they are doing, which is stuff that down or mask so highly that you get sick, or do something other than what a doctor or therapist might recommend, because
Yes.
that would be acknowledging it as a disability, which they don't want to do.
Yes, and a lot of it is also just like stubbornness, right? Like autistic people can be pretty stubborn and rigid. And if you don't know that you have autism, you might not know that, hey, maybe I'm being irrationally stubborn in this context. Maybe I'm being irrationally rigid in this context. And that causes lots of problems. A lot of times the undiagnosed autistic parent needs to get help but refuses to get help, or needs to change but refuses to change, or cannot change. And that causes lots of issues. The autistic parents that I talk to who seem to be the happiest are ones who have very good supportive spouses. And the next larger thing is having a robust social support network outside of your spouse. So if grandparents are in the picture and they're good, yay. Sometimes grandparents can be a hindrance because they also don't believe their child has autism. There's a lot of, my child isn't autistic, they're just like I was, type of thing coming from grandparents, or autism is just a trendy thing, he needs more discipline, which doesn't help. And
once you add grandparent, parent, child relationships, you also will get grandparents who see their adult children parenting differently than they were parented. And depending on the grandparent, will take that extremely personally. Will be like, but I didn't handle it this way with you. Are you saying that I was a terrible parent to you because you're parenting your kid differently? You get some of that.
Yep, you get many, many issues, especially if the grandparent is undiagnosed autistic. Undiagnosed autism seems to cause many issues. The other like success factor is, do you know you're autistic? If you do not know you're autistic, so a very common reported thing is, I was really struggling, I was having a lot of problems, my kid got diagnosed with autism, I got diagnosed with autism, and then all of a sudden a lot of my parenting experiences started to make way more sense than they previously had, and things started to get better. Normally, I tell people that the quality of life increases by around 30% when you get diagnosed. And that is from self-report data of people telling me that's around how much it improved their lives. With children in the mix, it can be a little more complicated than that, because autistic parents will report that they're like, okay, now that I know I'm autistic, I find myself far more sensitive to things that I would have just powered through. I find that knowing that I'm autistic has made me more sensitive to things that I was better at handling before because I would just stuff it down. And now in my brain, I have a loop that goes, oh no, that's autism. I'm having an autism symptom. And that can also be an issue. Overall, though, like directionally, the quality of life improves. and it will improve far more in some aspects than in others. So you will be less confused is generally the outcome, and you will be better able to interpret your own behavior. But yeah, that is that. The other really big trend that is very different from others, from their non-autistic peers in their denominations, is they are far less likely to regularly attend church. And they are far less likely to regularly attend church for issues related to their autistic children. And that's, we'll talk about that later. Any questions on any of those trends?
Mostly, how many drones do you have following me?
6. You specifically
Six.
6.
Okay. Six
You
drones
move around
following
a
me
lot.
specifically.
Yes.
Because everything you said either applies to me specifically or to a good friend, one of several good friends in my social circles. I am in the part of the bucket with the extremely supportive spouse and extremely supportive local to me grandparents who are all on the team. I have
Nice.
friends for whom that's not the case, that their
Sad.
kids' neuropsych reports and their own neuropsych reports would look a lot like mine. They're having a worse time than I am because either their kid's dad, whether they're married or divorced, either their kid's dad or a grandparent in the picture is making things harder instead of easier. I heard one of them say it's less like co-parenting and more like counter-parenting. And
Yep.
that is playing on hard mode.
Yes. Divorce is fairly common in autistic parents at around these ages. It is, as far as I can tell, less common than in non-Christian peers, but that is mostly because there is a lot of just stick it out technology in Christianity. So that's another issue. I have a few questions that I solicited for this episode, which some of them are a little more sad than others, but I think they deserve answering because some people will probably be wondering, how common is regret? Like, how common is it for autistic parents to regret having children? What would you guess about that, Alyssa?
Oh, I don't know how you'd even accurately collect that data because
Correct.
I
That is.
don't know how, if someone has that thought, it would be hard. They're not going to go blogging about it probably, so your drones are not going to catch them that way. And they would have to feel extremely safe to feel okay saying that. Um,
Yes. So here's how I measure this. There is a sentiment that you find, and you can do a lot of interesting machine learning and LLM work to find this specifically. You tell the LLM, I want you to look for the following sentiment. I love my kids, but this is extremely hard, and I don't know how much longer I can do this. And you say, find in this data set that I'm going to give you, find me all the posts that report this kind of sentiment. And then give me all the posts and the usernames associated with those. And then you can pull them out, check them against the actual data set to make sure the LLM didn't hallucinate. And it is not uncommon. Is that regret? I don't know. But that is the way I figured out the closest thing that I would get, because people are very unlikely to say, I regret having kids, unless they are on a fully anonymous account or they know me really well. A lot of them know me really well at this point. I've been doing this for 12 years. I've established relationships with them, and it is not uncommon for them to say, if I could have done this all over again, I would have been a nun, or I would have just never gotten married and just stayed celibate for the rest of my life. Especially common for mothers to say that. It is not as common for autistic men to say that. It is common for autistic men to say this in the first 2 years. So when you're in the sort of infancy, like the first child in the first 2 years, it's very common for men to be like, wow, this sucks. Why is anyone ever a parent? This is horrible. That was my feeling for the first 2 years. My baby hated me as well. Just
Oh,
did not like me. at all. She
She
only
seems like
liked
a dad fan now.
she has warmed up to the idea of me, but in the first 2 years it was very difficult. And yeah, having your child constantly say I don't like you is not easy, especially when it's a 2 year old, so you know, like, it's not a rational being, and so it's like genuinely expressing his feelings and emotions. And yeah, so she only liked women, and specifically my wife. So it's apparently very common for breastfed babies to be very particularly attached to their mother. But yeah,
My children were the opposite. They wanted dad and not mom. Unless they were hungry, they did not want me. And I think a lot of that has to do with, I mean, at the time we did not know that any of us were autistic, but I'm not only autistic, I have a set of dynamic disabilities that affect me more sometimes than others. So I am not predictable to them. There are days when mom can pick you up and days where she can't. There are days when mom can take you on a walk to the park and days where she can't. And because all of my like other co-occurring disabilities like hypermobility and POTS where they fluctuate, it makes me unpredictable to them. And so when they were too young for me to explain, hey, my body's feeling this way today, so we can do this but not that, it was just easier for them to always know that. I mean, my husband doesn't have that set of disabilities. He pretty much feels today the way he felt yesterday, which is pretty much how he felt last week and will feel next month. It is pretty stable. And so he's so dependable and reliable that they, if they would default to him until I was no longer nursing them and therefore less disabled because nursing did make my disabilities worse.
yep, I can see that. Generally speaking, though, like the question of regret is one that is very hard to track and very hard to know for sure. I will say, though, that the sentiment that parenting is very hard and I wish it wasn't so hard and I wish this burden was taken from me sometimes is very, very common, especially if you have an autistic child, and especially the more that child is disabled. So the farther along the ASD 1, 2, 3 continuum you go, the more that sentiment pops up for obvious reasons. Just parenting a disabled child is a very difficult and often thankless task. And you will still love your kids. You still care about your kids. I don't think it's at all surprising that you will often find the sentiment like, I love my kids. It's extremely hard, and I don't know how much longer I can do this for. Even pops up commonly in the non-autistic parents of autistic children. Just in general, it's hard. What's their favorite age or favorite age range? Usually it's 12 plus. Like once they start being more reasonable is typically when you get it. Once they have more emotional regulation and more intelligence, and generally speaking, as you get older, you have fewer weird regulation issues. You just get more used to it and better on top of it. And so typically, as you get older, you also get smarter and more able to do things, and you are easier to interact with. You need less constant affection and reassurance and more subtle support and things like that, which is much easier to do. And so typically they will say it gets easier and easier at every stage. And so the stage they enjoy most, like the 14 to 18 bucket, is the one where they're like, this is fine. You have less free time generally because you're driving your kids to activities and you're dropping them off at stuff and all those things. But other than that, yeah. How relationships with other moms and other mom groups, wild. How are your relationships with non-autistic moms?
Um, no, unsustainable mostly. Um, so I was not aware of my autism or my kids' autism for the first 8+ years of being a mom. So I just I chalked that disconnect between myself and other parents up to all kinds of things, some of which I probably just invented to make it make sense. I would think like, oh, when our kids started school, as a 3-year-old started preschool, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna get some built-in friends because of my kids' classmates' parents. But that didn't happen, and at the time I chalked that up to, well, that's probably because I have a newborn at home, and so I'm kind of on newborn schedule. But so then I'd try to make friends with other moms through like mom and baby kind of groups through the library or church or other things. And it was just exhausting. And also, my baby did not like to be around other people. She really just wanted to be at home. And so I'd find reasons. And I've discovered over time, though, that if I meet a mom at an event or a playground or anything like that, and she very quickly wants to become best friends, one of two things are happening. She either is trying to recruit me into her downline for her multi-level marketing scheme, and I am mistaking it as a bid for friendship, or she is also a late diagnosed autistic or ADHD woman with significant religious trauma. It is one of those two things every time.
Yep, that is the typical report is relating to other parents. Basically, do not relate to them unless they are also autistic, or if they're not autistic but have autistic children. Um, Generally speaking, again, like 82% of the people in my data set have an autistic child. And when you have an autistic child, it's often difficult for that child to be friends with their children. It's hard for them to get along with people, and that causes issues and friction. And they will have specific issues that other moms simply do not understand and cannot understand. And the only ones who typically really get it are the other moms or the other parents.
I think so. It's been a little over 2 years since my kids and I were diagnosed. And if you'd asked me 2 years ago, what are your relationships like with other moms who are not autistic? I would say, no, I have a lot of mom friends who are not autistic. In the last 2 years, so many of them have either been diagnosed with autism or ADHD or some other neurodivergent thing with overlapping traits themselves that now I'm having a hard time thinking of very many other moms I know that I am close with who are not either neurodivergent or have neurodivergent kids, even though I would didn't know that a couple years ago. We're falling like dominoes, and I sometimes I look at my friend group and I'm like, wait, was I the first domino? Is that what happened? That I got diagnosed and then kind of wouldn't shut up about it while I tried to find out if I was alone in the universe. And then some of you started saying, no, that's just everyone. And I'd say, oh, I thought it was just everyone too, but the doctor said this. And then they will research more for themselves or for their kids.
Yes. Many, many such cases, I will say quite confidently. It is an extremely common thing for that to happen. One of the biggest things that I find in the data set is one person in a parent group gets diagnosed, and then all their friends start getting diagnosed. Often what will happen is one friend in the friend group gets pregnant, has a child, that child turns out autistic, and then she goes to everyone, is like, ah! the autism, it's a thing, we all need to look into it. And then those other parents start having kids, and then one of those children turns out autistic, and then it's like, oh, did we accidentally just find all the autistics in college?
Yes.
And the answer is yes, you did. You just naturally found each other and homophilically clumped your way to victory, I guess. That's basically what happens. Another question I got was about, what do moms think of neurodiversity? Generally speaking, the mothers of autistic children are on the neurodiversity train that I talk to. They are on the neurodiversity train for a lot of reasons. The first reason is that is the thing that is given to them typically at most clinics. Especially if you're on the more liberal progressive side and you go to a more liberal progressive minded clinician, you will get that. 2, it is great for kids. The neurodiversity framing is what you want to be giving your children, right? You don't want to be saddling your children with the idea that actually your brain's a little messed up and you're probably going to have to live with these conditions for life. It's going to be very hard for you to find a job. It's going to be very hard for you to make friends. The struggles you're dealing with right now are probably going to persist well into adulthood, and things aren't going to get a whole lot better. It's not a message you want to give an 8-year-old. What you want to give
Not
the
because
8-year-old.
you, yeah, not because you want to lie to them, but because that is not information that is developmentally appropriate for them to process. And also information that is not neutral. And so you can end up with a kid who, because now you're layering maybe shame or worry onto a trouble they
Yep.
already have, it's going to make their already existing struggles worse.
Yes, it is going to be bad for them. I encourage, like, despite all of my critiques of neurodiversity, I heavily encourage parents of autistic children to lean into that for their children, because I think it is a good message for children to have. Your brain's just different. You can overcome this. You just think about the world differently. It's not bad. It's okay. You have strengths and other people have weaknesses, and you have weaknesses where other people have strengths. This isn't bad. It's just different. There are all sorts of different things in the world. This is a good digestible message for children to have. And so by far, most parents of autistic children who are autistic themselves are also on the train. Because it is the best, most effective tool for parenting a child who has a neurodevelopmental disorder. And so, yeah, the only exceptions to that are when you start getting to the more severe end. So most of the parents of ASD3 kids that I meet are not on the neurodiversity train and kind of roll their eyes at it, because they're like, no, it's sort of obvious something's wrong with my kid. let's not play around here. And also, my kid doesn't understand what neurodiversity means. They have like a significant intellectual disability and autism, and it's not helping very much. But yeah, it is a very good message for children to get, and it is a very useful message for children to get. My only beef with the neurodiversity framework is that you tell your child when they're 8 that the dog went to go live at grandpa's house on the farm. It's kind of weird if you still believe that when you're 30. You tell that to a kid because it's developmentally more appropriate, or you don't want to deal with
See,
having
I
to
get
teach
hung
them.
up on, I've heard you give that example before, and I get hung up on it because we would never tell our kids that. Like, we would be telling our kids gently that their dog died. Now, this is part of the reason we don't have a pet, is because I don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yes.
but they have had, pets that they were close to from friends or their school that have died, and that, like, no, we just have to have the conversation, and it just has to suck.
Yes.
Similarly, but with lower stakes, like, I think that, tell me if this is a good analogy, it seems a little bit like you're framing neurodiversity framework for kids like the way we use the tooth fairy to help it be less scary that, your outside bones are falling out, or whatever, from the
Yes.
Kimmy Schmidt song.
Yes.
Um, my my children, though, would find it so appalling, even as young kids, to think that we had lied to them, that we never said, the tooth fairy's coming when you lose your tooth. We said, hey, some people play a game called Tooth Fairy. It's a lot like the Santa game and the Easter Bunny game that other families play, but that you have told us you don't want to play. So I think of it less as I am giving my kids an imaginary story that helps them cope, and more that I am giving them an incomplete story and they will learn more of it later.
Yeah. Like it's sort of like trying to explain war to a child. Like there are people who are disagreeing with each other and they're fighting over it, and it's very sad, is something you tell them, and not like, well, you see, this is all connected to our strategic desires to control resource flow in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. Children don't understand that. And so the sort of often uncomfortable cosmic horror of learning you have autism and will be, to some extent, more or less unable to access a wide variety of normative human experiences, is not a message that 8-year-olds do well with in general. Because they don't have the faculties to understand what it is. I think neurodiversity is developmentally appropriate for children,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the useful thing and it's the good thing to use
Mm-hmm.
for them. And so, yeah, most parents
And
are on board the train.
well, and we got extremely on that train at diagnosis at the encouragement of our family's neuropsychologist. And it was not until I don't know, maybe a year and a half later that the social aspect of my older kid's autism started causing him some difficulties with peers at school. If it was causing him difficulties before that, he was oblivious to it. It was starting to cause difficulties that he noticed as a kid who was becoming closer to a preteen than to a little kid. And so we had to, I don't know, we joked that we had to have the talk, but the talk wasn't about like where babies come from or anything like that. It was about like how we look at different models of disability and how they affect our lives. Like he needed to know that because he didn't understand that he had a disability. Like I think we have therapists and doctors who've done such a good job making him feel like he is just going to hang out with his friend who likes to talk about Lego Star Wars with him while the therapy is happening, that he didn't feel like I am going to all these doctor's appointments. He felt like these are my grown up friends who play Star Wars with me. But so when I said, well, so there's a part of your autism that is going to make having friends feel different than it is for some of your peers. That's just kind of part of the disability. And he got really angry at me for using the word disabled. And I had to say, wait a second, are you aware that you have a disability like me? And we had to talk about that. And because we'd gone so hard with neurodiversity that he did not have a framework for what disability was. So instead of just because he was pushing back on it, I then had to say, like, okay, so you don't want to say you have a disability. I get that. But like, what are some examples of disabilities? Your grandfather wears a hearing aid. I wear glasses. We have friends at church who use mobility aids. Do you think any of those people are less valuable people? And he's like, well, no, that's stupid. I was like, you're right. That would be stupid. And so we talked about a combination of social and medical model, but he needed something to reject. And so I had to say, like, well, some people also think that disability is the result of you did something wrong or someone in your family did something wrong. And he's like, well, that's stupid. I was like, okay, so let's reject the moral model and let's take some pieces of the social model where they help us and some pieces of the medical model where they help us. But yeah, that's not usually what people mean when they mean to talk. I'm not a monster. I also gave him a cookie while we had this conversation.
Yeah, no, yeah. So that's generally attitudes toward neurodiversity, and yeah, again, you often have to carefully message these things to them, like you just discussed. That is very common. There are some other big differences. So I've noticed pretty significant differences between parents who are diagnosed before they have a child and parents diagnosed with their child. The parents who are diagnosed before are way, way better prepared than the ones who aren't. The ones who are diagnosed before are typically looking for signs of autism in their child because they know it's genetic. And so they are sort of on top of it from day one and will catch it pretty early and will know exactly what to look for. So I am constantly looking for signs in my daughter. So far, none. We'll see with the next one. In my nieces and nephews, immediately doing basic assessments on them. 2 of them are autistic, definitely. And, I let my siblings know that they probably have an autistic child. And yeah, because just knowing it early allows you to better plan, right? Not having crucial information about the fact that your child is disabled is going to be much harder for you. And so one of the reasons I encourage people to get diagnosis, or at least to look into it and be aware that it's probably a thing for them, is because it allows you to plan. Yeah, the ones who aren't are typically pretty blindsided by it. And so this looks like, their child is having issues, maybe motor issues, maybe speech delays, maybe just social integration issues, and then they go to a neuropsych or a clinician of some sort, and the clinician goes, yeah, your child has autism, and they go, ah. And what follows is a furious dive through the library and a buying every book, subscribing to every blog, emailing your favorite Christianity podcaster about it. I love those emails. This is not saying don't send those emails. You can send me those emails. But yeah, emailing me being like, my child got diagnosed. What do I do? And listening to all the podcasts and everything like that. And I go, well, this podcast probably won't be helpful for you, for your child. It might be helpful for you, So maybe listen to that as a learn about yourself rather than learn about your child, or maybe learn about your spouse. You never know. And so that's typically what happened. Is that pretty much what happened with you?
Basically, my kid had been in and out of OT for motor skills, particularly for like his anything to do with like fine motor skills, since he was 4. And then when he was 8, his OT, who we really liked, kind of pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I think that there are some things going on with your kid that are beyond what I have the capability to assess in this office. I think you need a more thorough neuropsych evaluation." And I said, "Well, what things?" And she listed a lot of things that she said were, she didn't use the word autism, but she just said, signs that there might be other things going on, is what she kept saying. And all of these things described me as well. And I just said, ma'am, what you're describing is the human condition. These things are true of everyone. And she said, "Well, if you believe that, I recommend you also get evaluated." This worked out pretty well because my 8-year-old at the time absolutely refused to comply with an evaluation unless he knew I was getting one too, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair. And at the time,
I love
we
autistic
happened
child logic.
we happened to have insurance that would cooperate with that at the time, and so we just did it. I think if we'd had to pay out of pocket, I might not have bothered, because I, again, did not see what the issue was. So they had, I think I thought that what we were looking for was ADHD. And so I brought my kid into his like very long, like day long assessment, spent the first, 30 or 45 minutes with him and the neuropsych together before I went across the hall to the other evaluator to do the adult version of the tests. And as I was about to walk across the hall, the neuropsych told me, "Hey, I know you were talking about ADHD. Would you just mention to your evaluator that there may be a family history of autism?" And I'm like, "We don't have a family history of autism. I don't know what you're talking about." So I mentioned this to my assessor, and he picks up the DSM-V, DSM-5. I say V, I don't know, DSM-5, and everyone does, Roman numerals. And he digs through it, he glances through the autism listing, and he says, "No, you're not autistic because you have friends and you're a performer and you work with people for your job and you seem comfortable enough right now talking to me in this room." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I must not be autistic." And then does like the ADHD assessment on me. He hands me a piece of paper that is, I asked him, "Why are you giving me an inventory of my character flaws and every reason I've ever had a fight with someone I love or lost a job?" And he's like, "This is just a list of ADHD symptoms, ma'am. This is not even personalized." But there was still something about it that he said, "But some of these things don't fit ADHD. There's something else. I don't really know what. Good luck." So I took this updated information to the neurologist that I had been seeing for years for my migraines. And I told him that I had some complaints about the testing process. And he said, "Yeah, those personality inventories, they're important to do for insurance purposes, but they're not really designed for people on the spectrum because we are used to giving people what we think they want from us instead of our actual answers from our experience." And I was like, "Okay, that makes sense. Hang on. Wait a minute. Those of who on what spectrum?" And I'm like, who is us here?" And he's like, "People on the autism spectrum like me." And also you. And he either assumed I already knew this or thought this was just the most effective way to break this news to me that he had known for years and just not shared with me because it wasn't why I was there. And then later that day, we had the meeting with my kid's neuropsych, who opened up this conversation about his diagnosis by saying, "By the way, Mom, you know that you are autistic too, right?" And I said, "Okay, so my neuropsych has known me, or my neurologist has known me for years, so he has a lot of data, but you only met me for 45 minutes." And she said, "Well, it only really took 10."
Clocked.
It was very, she's like, it was very obvious by the way you interact with your kid. And I still don't entirely know what that means. I interact with my kid like a human person because he's a human person that I am interacting with. I still don't know what that means. But apparently, she said the way I spoke to my children was outside of the bounds of typical, which I thought was, I still don't know entirely. I'd said I didn't know what that meant, and I'd complained about it to my husband. And then later that night, he found me like horsing around with our, at the time she was 5-year old, and we were having an argument about if something was slander or if it was libel while we like wrestled. And he's like, "So you just talk normally to your kids, huh?" And I was like, "Yes, this is how people talk." He's like, "No, it's how you talk." It's like, well, she's learning to write. She needs to understand about libel.
Don't we all? Yeah, but so that story is extremely typical of people who do not know they're autistic. Like the exact sequence is very similar of finding it out. Yeah, another big factor that leads to whether or not a child gets diagnosed is just how severe their symptoms are. Obviously, the more severe they are, the more likely they are to get diagnosed, and then the more likely you are to get diagnosed as a result. Um, Getting support for the child, people ask me about this. Overall, the trend is it's a massive nightmare, and it is all contextual, and there is no good solution, and everything is going to have trade-offs and ups and downs, and you will have to go shopping for clinics and doctors and clinicians, and you will probably have to try a few, and there will be no easy way to do it. If you are in the States, you will have to navigate complex insurance pathways. If you are in Canada or the UK, you will go on very long waiting lists. There is no great solution or no great experience here. The books and guides out there that exists, like we've kind of talked about, there aren't many good ones that are specifically for autistic parents of autistic children. Most books assume you don't have autism, or they assume that your child is like ASD3 and you have to grieve the loss of your child, and you're like, okay, it's not that bad. Like we're not quite at that territory here. Like he's got some problems, but it's not like, oh no, my dead child that I wish I had. Or the other set of like, have you tried getting your kid to chug bleach? Maybe that'll cure their autism. Or don't make them eat gluten, and all
Yeah,
that
it's just
stuff.
like full biomedical model. And we talked a lot about that when we
Yes.
talked about Spaces on the Spectrum by Catherine Tan, one of the best and only well-written autism books I've found so far.
Yes,
Um, and
it's
it still
well worth
doesn't
the
tell
read.
you what to do. It just tells
No.
you what is happening.
Yes. Yeah, and it's a very good book. I would recommend Spaces on the Spectrum
Yeah.
by Catherine Tan.
Yeah. We have a
But
previous episode where we basically went
we
through it
do.
chapter by chapter.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. She's an excellent
about
writer. Anyway.
about finding a provider, one of the things we struggled with is you can't, so we live in a major metropolitan area. So theoretically, there should be a lot of doctors and therapists and occupational therapists who to choose from, and there are, but you can't know from their website or a phone call, even if it says we work with autistic kids, what they think that means. And if their concept of autism overlaps with your kid's expression of autism. We have run into problems with that several times, some of which were just sort of useless and some of which were actively harmful, either to my kids or to myself. And so now, after some like huge therapy backfiring experiences, I am the most annoying parent before my kid even walks into that office. When we changed to a different pediatrician, I had so many conversations on the phone that they had to escalate to a manager because nobody knew the answer. And the manager of the office asked me if I had a background in medical administration because I was asking questions that only someone with a background in medical administration would have. I am an unaccredited Latin teacher and amateur mime. I don't know anything about medical administration, but I know that if the waiting room is set up this way, my kid is probably going to be okay. But if it's set up that way, we may not even be able to get into the office. So I'm going to have questions about what is the affect of your receptionist, right? Like things that people don't ask before they find a pediatrician for their kids. But I'm telling you, it's not just that my kid will have a bad time if these things aren't set up well. It's that we will not be able to complete the appointment without someone getting injured. And so it's, you have to do that level, at least I, maybe other people don't, but I have to do that level of advocacy every time. If it's a doctor my kid only sees a couple times a year because it's a general checkup. For the we had one therapist who was recommended to us for our kid for like social emotional things, and who advertised that she worked with complex kids, meaning that they've got autism going on, but they also have ADHD or anxiety or complex trauma or intellectual disability or giftedness, anything that puts them far outside the normal range. And we worked with this therapist for a while until she finally disclosed what she thought was the actual problem, which is that my kid's autistic traits, what some people would call his autistic meltdowns, were really the result of neglectful parenting. And that some people will say that their children have a disability because they don't want to do the hard work of real parenting. Was said to my face with a very sweet smile. And it rattled me enough that instead of just being like, what, that sounds not like nonsense, I was like, okay, well, does she have a point? Is the problem that I suck? Like, is that the core problem? And how do I find this out? And the way I tried to find this out, that was actually very helpful for me, was that we dug around on this therapist's LinkedIn and found out what church she regularly volunteers at. And then I went to that church's website and wondered, what do they believe about hierarchy within families, and listened to their most recent sermon series on the book of Ephesians and learned, like, this is how I evaluated where is this therapist coming from and should I listen to her? Because I could just be wrong. I'm not an expert. Or she could be not a good fit for my family. And it's hard to know because if you looked at their website, it says all the neurodiversity affirming things and you just can't know. So the only good ways I have found to find providers is find the other parents of autistic kids in the area and find the ones whose kids are a little like yours and see who they've already ruled out so you can skip some people.
Yes, that is
It's
the
the
reality.
only way.
The autism
If you
support
live,
is heavily based in the autism mom group chat.
it is. And it's even hard to find the good group chat because if you end up in the wrong regional group chat, they're mostly talking about how their kids are just like the kids in telepathy tapes. And isn't that great? And then others are, you know, and then it's like, oh, I'm in the wrong place. I don't think this is going to help me. When we found a therapist for my kid who it was the best fit possible, we have now followed her from one practice to another as her career has changed. We're like, we will follow you anywhere. If you move to another state, we will have a talk. But he sat us down after we had had several therapists that I had tried to talk to and saying like, okay, these are the several things my kid has going on all at once. And they'd say, okay, yeah, we have someone who will work with an autistic kid and we have someone else who will work with anxiety. I was like, okay, well, but he's one child. Like I can't send part of his brain to the autistic person and the other one to the anxiety person. Like he's one kid experiencing anxiety in an autistic way. Like they're not separable things. And this therapist that we came to love sat us down and said, so I read over your kid's neuropsych report, and I want you to know that I realize your kid is one whole entire kid, but he's got 5 diagnostic codes on here. It would not surprise me if he took the energy of 5 children to parent and to teach and to care for. So if you are wondering why you are more tired than your friends who have more children, you need to stop thinking of yourself as someone who has 2 children and think of yourself as someone who is caring for the equivalent of 5 to 8 children. And this was extremely helpful. And when I have passed this on, that change of thinking on to other parents of autistic kids, especially moms, they tend to just start crying immediately because they're like, oh, finally, a way I can think of that helps me understand why I'm so exhausted while still acknowledging that like my kid is a whole person as they are. So
Yeah, yeah, no, that's very much the case that I've gotten. I think it's worth pointing out, and this is pointed out on Spaces in the Spectrum, or Spaces on the Spectrum as well. This is overwhelmingly mother driven. The getting support for your autistic child is overwhelmingly mother driven. Isn't like that in some cases, but the person doing most of that work are autistic moms. When I talk to autistic dads, they have mostly offloaded it to their wives. That is just the reality. I'm not going to pretend that I am much better at that. This is just the reality of what happens. The autistic moms are the ones in the trenches and in the group chats. If you go to any conference for autism, if you go to any panel for autism, if you go
then the women's restroom line is so long,
yes,
and there is no line for the men's restroom. And the women's restroom line at the autism conference, focusing on caring for kids, man, you hear some stories. And they're stories that mostly made me think, okay, it's not that your kid is easy, but I don't think your problem is your kid. I think your problem is your husband.
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, many such cases. The song "Labor" by Paris Paloma comes up quite a bit.
The number of like neurodivergent moms in my circles that I love and have listened to, and I'm like, I can't do anything about the things that are hard for you, but I can offer my services of standing outside your husband's place of work with a boombox like John Cusack and say anything, blasting "Labor" by Paris Paloma at him. Would it help you if I offered the service of following him around blasting "Labor" by Paris Paloma?
Yes, unfortunately, this is a reality.
No one has taken me up on this yet, by the way, and I can't understand why.
Sad. One day you'll get it. But yeah, usually there's another factor, which is significant run-ins with school administration, either special ed or behavioral issues in school causing your child to have issues where you spend a lot of your time trying to figure out how to not get your child expelled, or how to get them to not be in detention, or how to the disciplinary actions they take are often ineffective. This leads the autistic children to have worse outcomes, and they're like, how do I get help? How do I get to a new school? A really common narrative is school hopping and church hopping, just going from one school to another, trying to figure out one that'll work. And oftentimes, even that is very hard. Not all schools work, and it might not be the school itself. It might just be that the child has issues with the school. And
say a disproportionate number of people at the most recent autism conference I was at were homeschooling, not for religious reasons at all, but because they felt like they had run out of options that were safe and acceptable for their kid.
Yep, that is common. That is quite common. Homeschooling is common for autistic kids, and it is a common thing that autistic Christians choose to do for their kids. Sometimes they're just like, I can't do homeschooling. I have to send them to a kid. Like, I am not made for this. But other times, it's often seen as a viable option, especially in a lot of Christian contexts. It's seen as a more viable option and even a laudable choice. And so they just go with homeschooling their kid. Yeah. Church issues specifically. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, so my family is an outlier there in that we lucked in way before we knew our kids were autistic to a school that had a lot of accommodations built in already. And they're just for everybody. They're not only for the autistic kid who has to then claim them. It's like, no, it's already a weird little school that doesn't believe in grades and doesn't have desks and has so many classroom animals. And, it's already set up that way. So when the neuropsych gave us the recommendations of school accommodations, they were all things about like environments for testing and extensions on group work, or the option to do things solo, or the option to move around the room. I was like, this is all just for every kid, right? Well, no, it's not just for every kid in most schools. The school we lucked into happens to be a Montessori one. I don't know that it's true of every Montessori school that would be good at this, but we have teachers who get it with our kids. But that is not true of my friends in either public or private schools, other private schools in our area. And for my job, I work with homeschool kids, and a lot of times I will end up with a student who the family doesn't realize that the kid is autistic, for the same reason that homeschool kids are often diagnosed with like vision issues or dyslexia much later than their peers, just because they're not needing to look at a board and they're doing things out loud at home. And so their parents are less likely to notice or like have a context for the different social emotional things they might see or sensory issues, because they've already adapted their home for this kid. So they don't see it until the kid is having trouble when they come to my like once a week class. But I have noticed that if a kid is a mostly homeschool but kind of hybrid school kid is doing poorly in all of their classes except for mine, it is not because my class is easy. It is because all of my lessons are written as though any of my students might be ADHD or autistic. And then I need to have a conversation with the parents about like, listen, I am not qualified to diagnose your kid. I am telling you your kid vibes with me, and here are some things about me. And this has led to the diagnosis of multiple homeschooled adolescents in my area.
Yes, I could very easily see that. Yep. Yep. So similar issues exist with church. So yeah, basically the same issues that exist with school exist in church. Churches often don't know how to accommodate. Like they just, it isn't even on their radar what autism is or how they're supposed to act around it. Many of them just have wrong ideas about autism. So the first time I disclosed an autism diagnosis to a priest, she told me that I should avoid gluten, and that would make me not autistic anymore. And
So was her citation a Facebook post?
I don't know what her citation was, but she told me I should stop eating gluten. And like that's
I'm like,
that was
yeah, an
in
autistic person with celiac should absolutely stop eating gluten. But
so
that's
true,
one of
so
those
true.
like, hey, if you're an autistic person who doesn't have celiac, this may not fix your problems.
Exactly. And so also just many weird ideas about what causes autism, like, oh, this is why you shouldn't have vaccinated your kids. And it's like, this is not helping anyone. Um, churches refusing to accommodate autism, so they don't deny the child has autism, but they think the best approach is like tough love, or they'll say, we don't believe in accommodations or special treatment. All children get treated the same, which is a very stupid mentality to have. If a kid's in a wheelchair ramp isn't treating them differently. It's allowing them to access the space.
And like, I have a friend, Sunita Kapahi-Tice, who is one of the few people that I know of who's like publicly posting about the intersection between parenting, faith, and autism kind of all at the
Yep.
same time.
She's a good follow.
And she's a great follow, and also just my buddy that I like to talk to. But she gives the example of, well, if your church, especially a large church, often has like either closed captioning service on their projector, or they have like hearing amplification for their older members so that they can hear the sermon and the announcements, is that treating the other people who don't need it unfairly? Like, why is that different than giving a younger kid who is autistic and needs to move around the freedom to move around as long as it can be done safely? Why is it different?
It is not fundamentally different.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, the reason they think it's different is because they don't think autism is real, or they don't think it's that big of a deal, or they just insist on a one-size-fits-all approach. Like, this is our kids program, this is how we're doing it, and if you're not doing it, you're going to get in line or you're going to get out. And so often they do get out. A lot of churches have a one-size-fits-all approach to things, and if you don't fit that, you are shown the door, and many of them take it. Like a lot of churches don't, like, if it's not a physical disability that they're familiar with, they don't want to accommodate it for reasons related to desire for ease, basically. Like, it's hard to accommodate autistic kids, and so yeah, that happens a lot.
And this ended up being, in the long run, good for my family because my kid, who was having at the time 4-year old, several years pre-diagnosis, was having what I'm sure other people thought were tantrums and bad behavior, but that what I at the time saw as panic attacks, now I would probably call them meltdowns, about the sensory environment in church. And my kid's takeaway from the loud sensory environment of the communion part of the service was, this is God's house, and so God must not love me. And so when we tried to talk to by the time we got to the point where we could talk to the church about, like, hey, is there anything we can do? We're already doing earphones. We're already doing this. Is there anything we can do? We already needed to be out the door because there was not a way to convince my kid that he was safe in the building. And it turns out my kid was right because we didn't know we were in a cult. And so following his sensory issues did get us out of an unsafe situation that we did not realize was so unsafe. So in that case, super helpful. But I think the only way that we are able to be in church now is that we go to a small church where several people who, like, from the beginning days of the church, had some kind of dynamic disability. So it was already built in, assuming that people have fluctuating capacity from the leadership. And this church is now disproportionately autistic, and I assume that's part of why. It's not that they've got everything figured out perfectly, but my kid needing to walk around or play with a fidget toy or just go sit out and, like, kind of read her own book instead of fully participating in the Sunday school story, none of those are seen as rebellion or disrespect or sins or parenting failures. They're just seen as, kids are going to kid. Do what you need to do. It doesn't mean that we haven't still had missteps and times where we've had to adjust and the church has had to adjust, but it's been a collaborative process instead of, have you considered just sacrificing your own selfish desires and toughing it out because of not understanding the difference between selfish desire and sensory need.
Yeah, many such cases. There's a final category of issues that these families will have with church, and that is the church wants to accommodate them but can't, just because there are, like, conflicting autisms and conflicting disabilities. There are no resources to provide extra support. Like, the kid needs someone. Sometimes mom or dad is able to, like, step up and be that support person for the kid, but sometimes it's not possible. And sometimes children have behavioral issues that genuinely, like, scare the other kids, and the church can't handle that, especially when you get into more, like, PDA and violent outburst territory.
That's where we live.
Very difficult to deal with, and often very difficult to deal with in a church setting, because it can make church scary for the other kids who are there, and that is also not fair to them. And so sometimes that, like, most frequently, autistic Christian women or autistic Christian parents will just stop taking their kids to church because it's too difficult. On top of all the normal reasons that autistic people already don't go to church. So there's that. Teaching children about Christianity is another thing I got asked about. It is often very hard. Teaching autistic children about Christianity can be a slog and very difficult. Autistic children tend to be hyper literal, extremely sensitive to a lot of the weird things in Christianity, being like, why is that there? Why is that there? You know, like, why did God kill everyone in the world on the flood? And just fixate on that and won't be able to drop it. And none of your answers will ever be able to satisfy this persistently obsessive autistic child. They often struggle with emotional reasoning and relational components of Christianity. And everyone around them is like, you should talk to Jesus. And they're like, Jesus isn't here. I can't see him. What am I supposed to say? Or like, well, just imagine him. Well, that's not him. That's my imagination of him. You get like the very rigid black and white thinking. Sometimes that rigid black and white thinking can lead them to be like, yep, this is what I'm doing. I'm just reading the Bible and going with it. And they will like
and
bite the bullet.
Sometimes you get a 6-year-old who's already in his Reddit atheist phase, even though he has never had access to the internet.
Yeah, many such cases. Often they get stuck in like scrupulosity spirals. So like learning about sin and they go, oh no, God hates me. God wants to die. God wants to kill me. Many maybe misinterpretations or maybe correct interpretations, depending on how you want to phrase it, of penal substitutionary atonement, where you explain to them that God wants to punish you and is just to punish you. And they go, oh no, I'm a bad, terrible person. And instead of being like, no, you're taking this too far, they go, yes, exactly, you get it. You're a bad person who's in need of saving. It's like, don't tell your child with religious scrupulosity. This is not what they need.
And like, this is one of those places where even if the parents are on the same team with each other and are being really thoughtful about where their kid is developmentally and what they can and can't process, this is where grandparents or Sunday school teachers can cause chaos.
Yep.
Completely unintentionally. Cases. Like I would, we have not tried anything like vacation Bible school or summer camp with my kids because they're not interested. If they were interested, I would be calling that place ahead of time to ask a lot of questions about what their altar call looks like, because that, I could see that backfiring so badly for my kids if they feel pressured and confused by metaphors that are not accessible to them or theology they've never encountered but is assumed in this place, that I would just rather not deal with the fallout of. And so they just aren't part of those communities. And I have found, I have friends whose the well-intentioned grandparents make it worse with the like, after a kid's meltdown, which, once a meltdown starts, a kid has limited control over it, but they see that as sin rather than that the kid just got overloaded with stuff that was beyond their capacity in the moment, and they will sit the kid down and try and get them to repent for the meltdown and ask Jesus' forgiveness for the meltdown, and Jesus didn't die so that you would act like this. That doesn't help. That makes everything harder, and at least according to me is not like great theology.
And so a very common thing that I have to a very common thing that I encounter is the parents will have to filter their mail and like read through, like if a grandma and grandpa wants to give the kid a book, they're like, no, you give it to us first. We need to read through it and then we'll give it to the child. But like there are certain things you just can't tell this child with extreme religious scrupulosity. And
we stopped reading children's storybook Bibles really early on because like I had thought this is going to be part of bedtime. We're going to read a children's retelling of Bible stories and we'll set that habit. But nope, the first time my kid as a 2-year-old noticed the illustration of Abraham and Isaac, it's like, nope, we're done. We can't actually do this anymore.
Yeah. A lot of them also... yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I do actually have resources for that. There are many things there are not resources for, and these are not autism specific, but they are the most autism friendly Christian like education of children, or discipleship of children resources that I'm aware of. And one is, I think I found both of these pre-diagnosis, but they were the only ones that seemed to fit my kids. One is Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And if you are, especially have a more liturgical background, you might want to read the religious potential of the child, or maybe it's the spiritual potential of the child. I think it's the religious potential of the child by Sophia Cavalletti, because it is very much about how to meet a child where they are developmentally in a liturgical context. And if you are coming from more of an evangelical context, even if you're ex-evangelical now, Meredith Miller's work on, She has a book called Woven. She has a newer book out that I haven't read yet. And she has a podcast where she actually talks through Bible stories in age appropriate ways with her own kids, is very neurodivergent kid friendly, and without ever feeling like you are lying to your kid about what is happening in this story. Like, she will straight up say, just don't tell the flood story to kids. Why are you doing that? Instead of, how do you kidify the flood story? And I appreciate that so much. So I've kind of combined those things, and then for other things, sort of applied Marissa Burt and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis's rubric in The Myth of Good Christian Parenting to help me judge if other resources are appropriate or if they are trying to use fear to sell me something.
Yes.
Marissa Burt has been on the show before.
She has. We reviewed her book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. You can find it there and at all places in that podcast episode and in all places you get your books. Yeah, another really big problem is autistic people, like autistic children, feeling the need to derive everything from scratch, and the parents being like, okay, some things you can't derive from scratch. You can't know this. It's not possible. But the autistic child not understanding the limits of epistemic knowledge, or the child not understanding the limits of knowledge creation and knowledge generation, not understanding why they can't just know it and figure it out themselves, is another difficult thing that a lot of these people explain to me, them having to do. But yeah, that's a lot of youth pastors as well are not typically equipped to deal with autistics. I've heard a lot of issues with, like, you know, in some traditions you start doing catechism when you're like 10 to 12, and that often autistic people have really start to struggle in it, because for a lot of people, especially ASD1 people, autism really starts to differentiate itself and really starts to show at age 12, and that's when people really notice it. And so,
because you're missing social cues with your peers. And so when that happens,
really change a lot.
Do you have any, like, either data or anecdotal data about when that happens? Do the autistic parents tend to be part of that, or like, are they included in this, or is this a thing that the kid is kind of going through on their own and the parents find out later? Are the parents getting in between the kid and the church to defend their kid or to make their kid be in church or anything like that?
It is all of the above.
Great. Are you saying it's a broad heterogeneous
yes
situation?
And they're like, because it's so church dependent, right? Some churches are well equipped to deal with it. Sometimes the kid likes the pastor or the youth pastor, and the youth pastor has a good relationship with them. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the child just has struggles that have nothing to do with the group dynamic and everything to do with autism, and just can't finish it for whatever reason, or really struggling with it for reasons related to obsession and stuff like that. And yeah, there really isn't any good way out of it. The final thing is, do you have any advice for how to parent autistic children, or any advice for the parents of autistic children, the autistic parents of autistic children? And my answer is no, I don't. This is a podcast that describes the reality. We are a descriptive podcast, not a prescriptive podcast. What I hope you got from this is things vary so wildly, it is hard to give any generic advice other than don't listen to random people's advice. Do what makes sense, be flexible, and you probably know your kids better than random people on the internet. So just like
be careful out there on those Instagram streets, because anybody with a Canva account can start making coaching content. And you don't have a good way of knowing if this is a therapist or someone who with a lot of experience who knows what they're doing, or someone who's just regurgitating to you things their therapist told them but might not apply to you. Like, I'm not saying they're all grifters. Some of them are. But I'm saying that it is a broad mixture of people who really know what they're doing, and their kids have been through it, and maybe you haven't found the local mom group chat to find the good doctors yet, and you need someone to help you talk through that. That is a way that coaching can be so useful. And also, it's a wildly unregulated industry. So you can get someone who's very confident, who doesn't know what they're doing. You can especially get a lot of people who are marketing to parents who are having a hard time, but either don't know to use neurodivergence language or don't like using it for whatever reason. So you will get a lot of offers, at least from like me and my circle, we get a lot of ads for coaching programs for parents of deeply feeling kids. They mean autistic and ADHD, but they're not going to say that. Parents of spicy kids, they mean autistic and ADHD, but they're not going to say that. Parents of, parents of quirky, parents of highly sensitive kids. I'm sure if Instagram had existed a generation or two ago, I would have gotten ads for your indigo children. And if it had existed several generations ago, I might have gotten ads for your changeling, helping understand your changeling. But like all these different, your highly sensitive person content, right? Things like that. I have found that when a friend tells me that, like, well, my kid and I are just HSPs, we're highly sensitive people, that I'm like, well, I'm starting the clock on when you tell me that actually there's something else going on there that you just don't realize, because that's what the algorithm is going to give you. And when I first started Googling ways that my kid was different from other kids as like a toddler, all the stuff it was giving me was HSP stuff, highly sensitive person stuff. I did not come across autism until someone put it in my hands.
Yep. And yeah, so your life is going to be throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping some of it sticks. And that is probably the only real approach that is out there. Find other people in your situation who you can tolerate. And hopefully they've thrown spaghetti at walls, and you can sort of combine your spaghetti wall sticking knowledge together to better understand what is going to help your one particular child. There are no silver bullets here. There are no one weird tricks. You aren't one weird tricking your way out of this situation. Being an autistic parent of autistic children is very hard. I know that's not really encouraging, but that is the observed reality that I have here. That it is, like, it isn't all bad. Like, you're not going to die. All kids have issues. Your kids probably will have much more issues. And you being an autistic parent are going to have issues related to those issues. And life, I guess. This is your life now. Hopefully.
And the thing is, it has always been the thing is, it's not, this is your life now. It was, this has been your life for a while and no one told you. So that helps me to understand that it's not that this is a thing that suddenly happened to us a couple of years ago. This is a thing that was ongoing for my kids since birth and for me since birth, and I did not have enough information to understand it. So I would misattribute issues I had either to my own like weakness of character or sin, or to other people's problems that really were just a mismatch between us. So having more complete information is good. Like getting a diagnosis, if the diagnosis is correct, is good. I don't know.
Yeah. So that is this episode. Good words to leave on. I am John. You can find me Christianity on the spectrum at gmail.com.
I love that you didn't take me up on clowning even once. It's great. I mean, I could, but that would be a whole different rabbit trail.
Yep. So I'm John. You can find me Christianity on the spectrum at gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at Christianity On. You can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. You can find me on Substack, Christianity on the Spectrum, or Dispatches from the Autism Wars, where I mostly write satirical content about my experiences within the autism communities and documenting them. That is me. Alyssa, anything for you?
I am on Blue Sky at Alyssa K, ALYSSAKAYE .bluesky.social. And that's really it. I don't have a coaching program to promote.
I would probably be skeptical of you if you did.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. See ya.